Hello there. It's Thursday, May 21st, and it's noon. And that means for us, it's time for Bites and Bits of History. My name is Bill Lawson. I'm Executive Director of the Mahoning Valley Historical Society here in Youngstown. And we're very happy that you're watching our video and virtual version of Bites and Bits of History today. As always, Bites and Bits of History is sponsored by the John and Loretta Hines Foundation, generous supporters of the Historical Society through the campaign for the Tyler Mahoning Valley History Center. And we thank them, as always, for being part of this program. This is our first time out with doing this on a virtual basis. We have a very interesting and wonderful program for today, and it revolves around an exhibit that opened in the Tyler Mahoning Valley History Center in our Youngstown Foundation Community History Gallery in late January of this year. It's called Crazy Quilts in the Mahoning Valley, and it was co-curated by two people. One is Virginia Draa, who is a professor emeritus at Youngstown State University, and also Jessica Trickett, who is the collections manager for the Mahoning Valley Historical Society. The exhibit looks at the history of the Victorian-era crazy quilts and features several examples of crazy quilts from the Historical Society's collections. These colorful patchwork pieces represent the skill and creativity and no rules really at all in terms of how everything went together, but really done in a colorful and very inspiring fashion by quilters in the mid to late 19th century. I would like to introduce one of our speakers, Dr. Virginia Draa, retired professor from Youngstown State University, where among other courses, she taught the history of fashion, history of interiors, and textile science. She has consulted with museums throughout the U.S. on items in their textile collections and volunteers with the textile collection for the Historical Society at the Arms Family Museum. Dr. Draa is also a textile artist, mother of two, and grandmother of three. Jessica Trickett is the Anne Kilcawley Christman Memorial Collections Manager for the Mahoning Valley Historical Society. She's been employed by MVHS since 1998. As manager of our collections, she curates the Historical Society's collection. She develops museum exhibits and works with other staff, interns, and volunteers to make the collection accessible to the public. She holds a Master of Arts degree in History and Certificate in Historic Preservation from Youngstown State University.
Hello there. My name is Jenny Draa. I'm also known as Dr. Virginia Draa. I'm Professor Emeritus from Youngstown State University. I taught there for quite a few years in the Department of Human Ecology, and among other courses, I taught textiles and history of fashion and history of interiors. And as I kind of became acquainted with the Mahoning Valley Historical Society, as a professor, I used the Arms Museum, which is part of one of the holdings of the Historical Society and where most of the textile collections are housed. I used them as a resource for my courses. So when we would be studying a particular era of clothing or interiors, we would often make a little class, have a classroom meeting at the museum instead of in our regular classroom. So that's how I became acquainted with the holdings and the textile collections and the amazing objects that and artifacts that the museum has in its collections. So when I retired, I was traveling around and I moved around a little bit and started doing some work for a couple of historical societies, and I kind of felt like there was a need for Mahoning Valley to have someone that maybe knew something about textiles and fashion and some of those pieces. I was consulted by students working there often, and even asked by the director a couple of times to come look at something and say, do you know what this is? or when it may have been in use. So I did have some experiences, and when I moved back to the Youngstown area, I got in touch with Jessica Trickett and said, hey, can I come volunteer and do something with your textiles? You have a need. And so that's how I kind of started cataloging some of the textile artifacts. And after a year or so, I had a conversation with Bill Lawson. He was telling me that there was some amazing quilts in the collection. So at one point I said, hey, could I see what you have? Could I work on the quilts? And so I enlisted some help from a couple of friends, and we started unrolling the quilts and making some documentation and studying those and photographing them and measuring them. We had some information, but not a whole lot to go on. So I spent probably about a year, and I don't even know if I'm done yet with cataloging all of the quilts, but we did see that we had some beautiful specimens of crazy quilts. And so when the gallery became available, and I was asked, could we do a display of quilts? And I looked at the size of the walls. I said, I think we could put crazy quilts on display and they would look really nice. So that's kind of becoming as kind of an interest in crazy quilts again. We're kind of seeing that among quilters. There's some interest in embroidery, included in quilts, and using different kinds of fabrics other than traditional cottons. I've been a quilter and I've taught quilting classes and just kind of been studied in that art. So this has kind of become, putting this collection together is kind of a merging a lot of my interests and the needs and interests of the museum into one display. So we're glad you joined us today to hear about and see some pictures of these amazing quilts. Jessica?
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, thank you. So I'm coming to you from the Tyler Histories Youngstown Foundation Community History Gallery, which is where we currently are showing these wonderful quilts in an exhibit that opened earlier this year. And it's called Embellishment and Excess, Victorian-era Crazy Quilts. Again, all featured from the Mahoning Valley collection here. And so since, though, of course, our sites remain closed for the time being, the exhibit, we're actually going to extend the run of this exhibit so that people, when we reopen, will be able to come back in and enjoy seeing these beautiful, colorful, wonderful examples of local artwork in person. And so the exhibit and the presentation you're going to see today are really the culmination of a couple of years worth of research, cataloging, and work done by Jenny and her friends as well. So Mahoning Valley Historical Society has been collecting artifacts like these that represent the history of our local people since 1875. And that means that we have artifacts that reflect really all facets of life, not just the quilts that you see here, but also personal items, clothing, costumes, the things Jenny has used in the past to show her students what it was like to dress in the 19th century. Also, we have things that are, tools for work and home life, furnishings, artwork, documents, photographs, diaries, things that represent all facets of religious work and personal family life here in the Mahoning Valley over the centuries. So with that being said, we're going to get started with our presentation, show you some images of these wonderful pieces that we have in our collection that we want to bring to life for you today as well. The history of crazy quilts really begins in, again, the Victorian era that we mentioned. They're really representative of the contemporary culture of that era and were made mostly of silk from the late 1870s through the early 20th century. These quilts' random piecing supposedly imitates the design of Japanese ceramics that were very popular during that time. They had small pieces of fabric that were embroidered and painted with different motifs taken from design trends of the period and the personal interests of their makers.
So crazy quilts were not actually pieced or quilted. Most were made from small random shapes of velvet and brocades, silk suitings, men's suitings, dress fabrics, and they were stitched to squares of background fabric. In some quilts, as fabric has worn away, we can see that these were not often well planned out. They may have used a piece of a uh, seed sack, a flour sack, sheeting, an old tablecloth, whatever they could find that they could cut into rectangles. They would then join these pieces together with the decorative stitching. They were embellished with embroidery, the decorative stitches over the seams. Sometimes there were ribbons, sometimes there were actual pieces of floral designs, buttons, hand-painted flowers and other items may have also been included, but they were excessively decorated. And so they were also tied to the backing. Oftentimes they were tied with ribbon and thread. They're known as parlor quilts because they're smaller than bed size coverings. They were then just not used in bedrooms, but they were displayed on sofas, chairs, tables, in the more public spaces, in the more decorative rooms of the Victorian home. That time people entertained in their parlor, which probably was like their modern day living room, but it was called their parlor, and it was used for entertaining guests. And so these quilts were meant to be put on display. They were meant to be personalized. They were meant to showcase the luxury of the fabrics that were preferred by their makers. So they weren't made for warmth. They were just made to impress and put on display.
So the crazy quilt craze and explosion that really kind of took over the late 19th century was made possible by a couple of different things, especially technological advances and also the sharing of global cultural traditions. One of the advancements that really made this possible was bringing of silk production to the United States. Silkworm farming has really always been unique to Asia, and especially Japan and China. But in the second half of the 19th century, Asian silk cocoons were exported here to the United States for processing into fibers and fabrics. Silk cocoons had never really been produced successfully in the United States because the northern climate was really not suitable for growing mulberry trees, which was the food consumed by silkworms. And then in the South, they preferred to grow cotton fiber rather than the very labor-intensive production of silk fiber. The image you're seeing here is of the Tomioka silk mill in Japan, image taken right around the year 1904, and it is courtesy of Boston Public Library.
So what you're seeing here is an example of a silk cocoon and processed silk fibers. That little egg-shaped oval at the bottom is an actual cocoon. The silk, they didn't wait for the moth to emerge from its cocoon. They would basically immerse the silk cocoon with the moth inside into liquid, and that would then allow them to begin to spin out the fiber, which is what you see in a hank above the cocoon. So by the last quarter of the 19th century, the United States had become the largest producer of silk fabric and thread in the world. The low cost of the silk fabrics at that time, because they were producing so much, along with the clothing styles of the times, made silk fiber and fabric very popular with American consumers. So dresses would take often 9 to 12 yards of fabric, but with the way they'd be cut, there would be fabric left over from either the home production or professional production of the garments. And these pieces of silk, the scraps, would find their way into crazy quilts. Crazy quilts are called that partly because of the look of silk porcelain, of Japanese porcelains that kind of had a cracked ice or crazed appearance. And so since they were trying to imitate everything Asian at that time, imitating those shapes, those kind of odd shapes that you would get if you cracked a piece of ice, a sheet of ice, that's what they were made to look like. So other technological advances allowed for many labor-saving devices for the home in the later half of the 19th century. And while in earlier decades, the middle-class homemaker would have had to labor next to her servants to complete the many tasks that were necessary to run her household, by the late part of the 19th century, the maker of crazy quilts actually found some leisure time available. And she would use this to practice her needlework skills and to add to this excessive expression of material culture of that late Victorian lifestyle. What you see here is a pattern that was shown or what that was featured in the July 1884 issue of a popular ladies magazine called Godey's Ladies Book. And in these ladies magazines, crazy quilt designs were featured as one of the regular articles in the magazine. Suggested patterns would be published, and directions and ideas for materials would be seen. They would also have advertisements for companies that produced pieces of silk with designs stamped on them, and actual kits with pieces of silk cut and patterns that you would then cut your pieces to fit and look like the design that you were given. But these ladies magazines of the latter part of the 19th century were a popular source, not only for fashion and home decorating ideas, but for these crazy quilt designs. And they were seen in these magazines from around 1880 to 1900, when this craze began to wane as a trend in home decorating.
In this particular pattern that we're featuring here, while it was published again in the ladies magazine, is also featured in a book called Crazy Quilts, A Beginner's Guide by Betty Fikes Pillsbury. And she gives a great background on the history of crazy quilts, and then again some examples of contemporary interpretations of crazy quilting in the modern era. So while this crazy quilt mania was really spreading throughout the United States, of course the Mahoning Valley was no exception. Many ladies and groups of ladies created their own unique versions of these riotous textiles, and they added personal touches that really allowed them to express their interest in a way that restrictive pattern quilts did not. So these ladies were really given free range of expression, where they could add little bits and pieces that represented their own personalities to these quilts. And each of these quilts then in turn really became a representation of the person who made it, whether it featured, their embroidered initials, embroidered floral work. Again, in this particular patch, you have the American flag, which speaks to the creator's patriotism as well.
This quilt was started in 1884 by Ella Steele. It features feather stitching and a brown silk border. Ella Steele was active in the Daughters of the American Revolution of Summit County. The quilt has several commemorative ribbons included in the various blocks, along with other decorative stitching and designs. Many are from Civil War regiments and reunions, including the 6th Ohio Volunteer Cavalry of Warren, Ohio. One political ribbon is from the campaign of Republican James A. Garfield, so it pays tribute to the assassinated president.
So here you can see Ella signed her married name, which was Ella Stearns, to this quilt after she relocated to Iowa. The quilt, again, made in 1884 here, again made its way back here to the Mahoning Valley, representing Ella and her family's history here in the Mahoning Valley. Her great-great-grandchildren ended up donating it back to Mahoning Valley Historical Society, seeing it as a fitting home for the work of their great-great-grandmother. This next quilt was made by another Mahoning Valley descendant, Lydia Stroop McMahon. She lived from 1849 through 1916. And it features silk pieces and feather stitching and has a black silk ruffled border. So Lydia Stroop married John Corey McMahon in 1870. The McMahons were very early settlers in Youngstown. Joseph McMahon was probably a relative of Lydia's husband, was rather infamous here in the early history of Mahoning Valley. He was the first man to be tried for murder in Trumbull County. He and another settler were accused of killing 2 Native American men called Spotted John and Captain George. The men's families had been threatened, and then they had unfortunately killed these 2 Native American men here in Trumbull County. But McMahon was actually later acquitted of that crime.
So, this is a close-up of the Lydia's quilt, and it's an example of some of the very sad things that have happened to some of these beautiful, crazy quilts. Part of the silk making process made it susceptible to damage and destruction over time. Silk fiber is kind of a lightweight fiber, and when it's made into cloth, the cloth weighed less than the unprocessed cocoons. So if the processor was purchasing cocoons by the pound or by grams, when they processed the fiber, it often weighed less than the cocoons that they had purchased. And so in order to cause the fiber to weigh a little bit more so that they could recoup a little extra money, they would soak it in a solution. Also, the lightweight fabric didn't drape well, and the clothing styles of this latter half of the 19th century kind of required a better drapeability of the fabrics. This was also true in window coverings and other decorative items. So manufacturers, in order to add weight to the silk, to increase its cost and also its drapeability, would soak the silk fiber and fabric in solutions that contained lead, salt, tin salts, and over time, this worked well for the first few years when these garments were being worn and these window coverings were being used on windows. But after a period of time, and this quilt being well over 100 years old, that fiber in the silk, it weakens from that lead and tin that's incorporated into the fiber. And so the fiber breaks down and you see shattering and shredding of some of the silk. And so if you look closely, what appears to be a black pattern in some of those pieces of the quilt That's actually where the fabric has shredded. And in the, near the center, right under the pink piece, there's a piece that's completely gone. Now, if you have a quilt and you want to display it and it's got some of this kind of damage, you can kind of anchor the fabric, and we've actually done this with several pieces in the collection. You can kind of stitch a piece of netting over those spots that have the shredding and the shattering, and kind of protect it from further fiber loss or fabric loss. The damage is done, you cannot repair it. You wouldn't want to replace it. That would destroy some of the integrity of the quilt, but you can protect it a little bit so that it doesn't damage further.
This next quilt was made by Clara Lotz Blair. She lived from 1871 through 1956, and also other women, and it was made in 1885. It's a silk patchwork quilt with a tan backing and has a red ribbon border. It also has blocks made by at least 4 different people, as indicated by the maker's initials, and you can see here examples of embroidered and hand-painted initials in the blocks of this quilt.
Also, what caused us to think that this quilt would have some, have these different makers besides the different initials is there's different fabrics and stitching techniques that are repeated in some blocks, totally different stitches and fabrics in others. So that kind of led us to the conclusion that there were different people working on this quilt. Incorporated into the quilt are ribbons like this one from the Knights of Pythias Lodge, and also one in support of Grover Cleveland and Thomas Hendricks in the 1884 presidential election. And again, you can see completely different stitching appearance in these 2 different blocks. So obviously different makers.
So Clara Lotz Blair, the main maker of this quilt, was born in Girard, Ohio in 1871. She was also active in the Red Cross during World War I, and then afterward was involved in several local community groups, such as the Garden Club and the Girard High School Alumni Association. She was also one of the first directors of the Girard Community Improvement Corporation, and which was an organization that raised funds for community improvements in that area. Her father was named George Lotz, and he was a Girard jeweler at the time as well. This next quilt was made by Elizabeth Jones Perkins, who lived from 1851 through 1919, and the quilt itself was made in 1910. Elizabeth Jones was born in England, and she was born in 1851 and then emigrated sometime after 1860. She married Elizur Otis Perkins in Mahoning County in 1869, and she was living on the west side of Youngstown upon her death in 1919.
So this block, which you've seen before, features the maker's initials with a flag and an embroidered floral detail. Crazy quilts often employed Asian motifs, such as floral motifs. They also showcased fans, Asian looking fans, and so this is an example of one of those fans. Anything that was of Japanese origin became quite popular after the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. The Japanese had a pavilion there showcasing their artwork and all of their fabrics, and many of these motifs and designs found their way into quilts as well as other decorative items of this period. Another popular thing to include on quilts was related to another trend of the time. Kate Greenaway was a popular English illustrator of children's books of the 1880s and 1890s. Her drawings of children were reproduced as block prints in books, on greeting cards, other printed media. You could find actual artwork that was framed of some of her designs. And so, of course, they found their way into embroidery designs that are included on Crazy Quilts. And so here you see a little girl in the slide on the left, and a little boy sitting on a box, tooting a horn, and the one on the right. There are also hand-painted details in this quilt, and what is truly unique, a scrap cutout of a baby in a diaper or blanket as it would have been delivered by a stork, which was a popular design that related to babies and children of that time period.
This next quilt was made by members of the Sitz family in 1885. While we're not really sure who exactly made this quilt, we do know how it's made how the quilt made its way to the Mahoning Valley. Isabella Hancock Sitz was born in Easton, PA in 1886, and she married Earl Flad in 1910, and then the couple moved here to Youngstown shortly thereafter. So while Isabella was born after the quilt was made, she probably inherited it from her father's sisters. There were 6 sisters, and all of them may have contributed to the making of this quilt.
This quilt, again, is one of those that has the appearance of being made by several different people doing embroidery work on different blocks. And it features silk and satin patches with very colorful embroidered details. The aesthetic movement in the decorative arts featured Anglo-Japanese motifs like fans, beetles, cherry blossoms, owls, birds, and other floral designs, which were incorporated into this quilt, as well as some others that are in our collection. But also, there are quite a few different butterflies and even some spiders and spider webs included in this quilt, which again were popular design motifs from this period. This quilt sadly has an unknown maker. And so it kind of serves as an example to those of you who may be needle workers or have someone in your family who does needlework. Please, please make sure you document your family heirlooms for future generations so that we can preserve these important details and celebrate those whose works we preserve. This quilt employs a variety of stitching around multicolored commemorative patches from meetings and events. And even though we don't know who the maker is, we do know some things about the maker from what is included in this quilt.
So what we do know because of that documentary evidence on some of those ribbons is that it was made sometime after 1889. There are ribbons from a celebration of Washington's inauguration centennial in Hubbard, which again dates to 1889, and then also several ribbons from Civil War regimental reunions. This one on the right celebrated in 1887.
Also, the quilt maker may have been a teacher, as there are several ribbons from various teacher groups. This one on the left shows the Teachers Association of Cleveland having a meeting. Sandusky, I believe it says 1888 on it. And then the State Teachers Association, the State Teachers Association of Cleveland. And then also a ribbon from the Philomathians, which was a student literary society formed at the University of Pennsylvania in 1813. So possibly an English teacher. We can always make our guesses. Another thing featured on this quilt is a hand-painted owl. And you see this little owl that has been painted on this piece of velvet, I believe. And then there is a temperance ribbon.
And our next quilt for you here was made in 1884 by two young sisters named Amy Bressett, who lived from 1868 through 1966, and then Draa Bressett, who was born in 1867, passed away in 1884. The girls grew up at the McKinney farm, which was their mother's family home, and that was located at Market and Bressett Streets in Youngstown. Bressett is now known as Chalmers Avenue. Sadly, Draa Bressett died at the age of 17 the same year this quilt was made. Her sister Amy was active in her church and served in the Red Cross during both World War I and World War II.
So once again, we see commemorative ribbons on this quilt as well from local political activities, including the Youngstown Republicans, and a campaign ribbon for Grover Cleveland and Thomas Hendricks, the victors of the 1884 US presidential election. There are also ribbons from missionary organizations and church functions. Amy Bressett was a longtime member of the Trinity United Methodist Church. She died at age 97 in 1966. Also included are some hand-painted floral details.
This quilt here, it was made in 1907 by Hattie Garrett Bennington, who lived from 1870 through 1939. And she was born in Jackson County, Ohio in 1870, of course, then married John Bennington in Warren, Ohio in 1891. The quilt features blocks with patches of silk and taffeta and a red and cream ruffled border.
This one being a little bit, made a little bit later in time, also has a little bit of a different look to it. But again, it does include commemorative ribbons from several Civil War regimental reunions. The quilt maker's father, Albert B. Garrett, served during the Civil War in the 2nd West Virginia Cavalry. Unfortunately, Albert abandoned the family in 1876. His wife left the family as well, and the children were left to the guardianship of one of their mother's relatives. There are also ribbons from fraternal organizations like the Elks and the Weathersfield Temple of Honor number 19, a fraternal temperance order.
This quilt was made, or it is attributed to Laura Smith Wilkins, and was made between 1892 and 1895. Laura Smith was born in 1871 in Peekskill, New York. She met and married George Wilkins, an associate in the Wilkins Leonard hardware store in Youngstown. Laura died at the young age of 27, and her husband followed 2 years later, only 32 years old.
So there are several monograms embroidered onto the quilt. So perhaps Laura collaborated with her friends on some of the squares. The quilt features velvet patchwork with decorative stitches. And if you look at these stitches, they're a little bit different from the look of the other quilts that we've seen. The stitches are larger. The monograms aren't quite as decorative as these are. So I'm wondering if maybe Laura began this quilt when she was younger, since she died at the age of 27, and it's got dates of like 1892 on it. I'm wondering if she was a little bit younger when she started this and then completed it. There are also several embroidered insects. So these were beetles that were a popular motif at that time. And that carries over from our earlier theme of beetles and insects and animals that were used on quilts as well.
So that really brings us to the end of our presentation and the quilts that we have to share with you today. I just wanted to say I hope you've enjoyed the examples that we've shown you in our presentation, and then that you are again able to stop by the Mahoning Valley Historical Society Tyler History Center when we reopen, so you can see these wonderful pieces in person. We just wanted to give you a glimpse into what might have occupied the days and the times of Victorian women during this crazy quilt craze, as Jenny said, and how they really were able to express themselves and their needle skills, and how important it is for us to document and save these wonderful works of art from the Victorian era and from all eras of Mahoning Valley history. We collect from prehistory to the present. So we want, to document what it's like to be living here, even in our modern world, and the things that we're going through today. So keep in mind, that we would love to document your history here in our collection. And Jenny, do you have some closing remarks as well?
I just would like to say that if some people do have one of these treasures hanging out in their house or their mother's house or grandmother's house, and you may not know what to do with it, and I would just say it is a work of art. It may be worth a lot of money. It's also possible that it has some, some repair work that needs to be done. I have restored some crazy quilts as well as some other kinds of quilts. And if you want to leave a comment, if you have questions about what can be done with your treasure, I would really be interested in consulting with you and helping you with that. As a little side business, I do quilting for others, and I also do restoration and repair work on antique quilts for others as well. So leave comments if you want, or reach out to the museum and they'll put you in contact with me, and we can see what we can do with the treasures in your attic.
And again, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us today for this presentation. As Jenny mentioned, if you have any questions or comments for us, please go ahead and leave them in the comments of this post, and we will get back to you as soon as we possibly can. And just also invite you to join us again for additional programs coming up from Mahoning Valley Historical Society. We are always interested in sharing our collection with you, our programming with you, and we hope that you will share your history with us as well. And again, thank you so much for being with us today.
Along with this program being offered online in a virtual format, we invite you to look at other programs that we've augmented or developed in the last couple of months. Available through our website at mahoninghistory.org are two new programs. One is a blog page called Time Capsule. And what we're doing there is posting more in-depth stories and images related to our region's history. And more recently, we've had 3 installations there. One was done on April 22nd to line up with the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. The other was on May 3rd, before the 50th anniversary of the tragedy and massacre at Kent State University, which involved one local person. And then also on May 8th, we posted a blog on VE Day, 75 years later. And that was the first of 2 big announcements in 1945, which ended World War II. So I'm sure you'll enjoy those offerings. We also have Did You Know home projects, found also on our website, mahoninghistory.org. And these include a lot of historic subject matter, individuals, topics of general interest, and important events in the Mahoning Valley in our history. And they include projects that you can do at home with a lot of household items. So this is for all members of the family, and please give that a check out as well. Available through social media, especially on our Facebook page, is something called MVHS Artifact. And twice every week on Monday and Wednesday, we have offerings of items from the collections of the Mahoning Valley Historical Society with an in-depth look at its history, significance, and where it came from, and why it's important to have in our collection and on view in our Museum and History Center on a regular basis. If you haven't already, you can follow and like our page on Facebook for Mahoning Valley Historical Society. Also, we have a page for the Business and Media Archives of the Mahoning Valley, which has a lot of new content coming out there as well. Coming up next month in Bites and Bits of History, also in a virtual format, on Thursday, June 18th, our program will be What Brought Them Here? African American Migrations into the Mahoning Valley. And this will be presented by Stacy Adger, a longtime friend of the Historical Society, local historian, and genealogist. Stacy will look at the Underground Railroad, post-Civil War migration, and the Great Migration of the 20th century, and we'll discover factors which brought Blacks here from the South and what impact they have had on our community.